Thank you so much for honoring our invitation today. We really appreciate it, especially under these load shedding circumstances. Today is the first of a 4-part intergenerational feminist dialogue series. And today's theme is feminist activism, past, present, and the future. We truly want to create a space where we reflect as African feminists based in South Africa on where we have come in relation to our fight for an intersectional gender justice or gender liberatory project. Because if we don't reflect on where we've come, we can easily reverse those gains. Because a lot of our feminist gains today have been won through struggle, through direct action, through lobbying in various capacities, and it's important for us to remember so that we do not erode some of those political feminist gains. So this is a space to share, to think together, to reflect. It's not going to be too academic. It's going to be very personal. We've just provided our guest speakers a few guiding questions where they will each reflect on their journey and how they see or characterize, feminist struggle in South Africa today. But before I introduce each of our panelists, I'm going to ask Professor Amanda Coles to briefly explain the vision and the intention behind these intergenerational feminist dialogue series. Over to you, Prof. Coles. Prof. Coles, can you hear me? I hope she wasn't load-shedded. Okay, can we please give Prof. Coles a few minutes? She was just load-shedded. She'll be just back now once she reconnects. Prof. Coles, are you back?
Yes, that was load-shedding, but I'm back. Okay, do you want me to continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Simamkele. And I just also want to welcome everybody who is here today. I really appreciate it. We appreciate it. And I want to thank my organizing team, Simamkele, Dlakavu, Professor Debbie Bonnen, and Dr. Azul Kutsia. The reason for this series is that there are many series going on, seminar series on feminism going on at the moment, but we thought there is a gap. And that gap is that we need to have interpersonal or intergenerational conversations. I think very often we as generations don't speak to each other, or we understand our lived realities and subjectivities in terms of our own feminism very differently. So that is what we thought we would do, and this is the origin of the series. And we're going to have, as Simamkele said, 4 seminars. This one today is Feminism, Past, Present, and Future. The second one is Feminist Artists and Decolonizing Modes of Feminist Knowledge Production on the 18th of May. The third one, Feminist Legal Gains and Setbacks from the Zuma Rape Trial to the Coco Judgment on 15 June. And the fourth one, More Than a T-shirt, Slogan or Commodity, Remembering the Radical Roots of Feminism on the 27th of July. But we will send you invitations in advance. And I can say, as a member of the older generation, I finally entered Twitter. My Saatchi chair now has a Twitter account, so you can follow me on Twitter. Okay, thank you. Now, allow me, before we start, just to say something about the passing of Rhoda Kadali over the weekend. Since we're talking about the past, Rhoda is one of our feminist foremothers. And maybe some of you will be a bit annoyed that I mentioned Rhoda today, because in the last years of her life, she has strayed very far from a feminist vision. She became a Trump supporter and she became actually quite anti-feminist. But if we put that aside just for a moment and talk about the past, then I think, you know, Rhoda is my generation, and she was one of the people who actually was very instrumental in getting the gender equity unit going at the University of the Western Cape. She was instrumental in creating a sexual harassment policy, and she also supported the epistemological project of women in gender studies. And she was fearless in speaking truth to power. And I think for that, we should give her some recognition. Thank you. Simamkele, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Prof. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers today, but before I do so, I just want to take you through the format of today's discussion. We're going to have opening remarks from each of our speakers between 8 to 12 minutes on the theme and how they view the theme. And afterwards, we're going to have a discussion, a dialogue with each amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So I'm going to now introduce each of our speakers who have all contributed to the collective gender justice project in South Africa, from the transition to the from apartheid to a democratic state, to the recent Fallist movement and total shutdown movement. So we are grateful, first of all, to each of our speakers for their work within the communities and collectives that they work alongside. So I'm going to begin with Yvette Abrams. Yvette holds a PhD in economic history from the University of Cape Town. She has consulted for government and various NGOs on issues relating to gender equality in policy and practice, while publishing widely both locally and internationally on gender equality, queer theory, climate change, and the history of the First Nations South Africans. From 2007 to 2011, she served as a commissioner for gender equality, a monitoring and advocacy body set up under Chapter 9 of the South African Constitution, where she headed their programs on poverty, energy, and climate change. She subsequently worked as an advisor to Project 90 by 2030, an NGO which focuses on food security, energy, and promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency entrepreneurship in the context of climate change. In 2018, she served as a commissioner on the University of Cape Town Institutional's Reconciliation and Truth Commission. She founded a small business making handmade, organic, carbon-neutral soaps and body products on her small holding east of Cape Town. The work allowed plenty of time for reflection and lends depth to her writing. In this way, she sought to combine theory with practice in pursuit of a decolonization that reaches beyond words to the physical decolonization of land, square meter by square meter. Currently, she's, sorry, someone can they please mute themselves? Currently, she is the interim director of the San and Khoi Center in the Department of African Studies and Languages at the University of Cape Town. You can find her blog on www.khoilife.com. I'll just share the link later. Our second speaker is Atuwen Ndebeza, who I went to high school with, Ekomani in the Eastern Cape. Apiwe is a master's graduate in sociology, a feminist writer and researcher. She has participated in several stakeholder engagements across the sub-Saharan region to shape policies on gender-based violence and femicide, and adolescent sexual and reproductive health. She has further led and organized numerous protests and movements addressing GBV in the Eastern Cape, and much more. I think Apiwa is very modest in her bio. Amanda Hoos is our third speaker, and Amanda Hoos is a distinguished professor of political science at Stellenbosch University, where she holds a Sachi chair in gender politics. She holds a PhD from the University of Illinois in Alabama. Her specialization is South African politics and gender politics. Her research focuses on women and citizenship, the national gender machinery, women representation, and gender-based violence. And she has published widely in these areas. She is the editor of Unthinking Citizenship, a feminist debate in contemporary South Africa, amongst other great accomplishments. In 2017, she co-edited a book with Joy Watson, Nasty Woman Talk Back, which I love, appeared with Imbali Press, and in 2021, she co-edited a book with Olivia Ozobi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, titled COVID Diaries, Women's Experiences of the Pandemic. And she has a forthcoming edited book titled Feminist Institutionalism in South Africa, Designing for Equality. And she is a former commissioner for the South African Commission on Gender Equality. And our last speaker is a fellow Fallist, who I hold great respect and admiration for, Mbalenhle Mathandela, who is a master's graduate in African Studies from the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on public intellectualism and feminist activism on social media in Uganda. Mbalenhle is interested in how new media and technologies are influencing the way people learn. Mbalenhle is the co-director of The Scene, which is a social enterprise media outlet that curates socially conscious news for young people between the ages of 13 to 16 in Africa and the Caribbean. Her other interests include race and resistance, gender and media, education, gender-based violence, and militarism, which she writes about as a contributor for various news outlets in South Africa. Bali has previously worked in public interest law as the project coordinator for the right to protest at the Center for Applied Studies, CALS, at the University of the Witwatersrand. Mbalenhle received her Bachelor of Social Sciences degree in the Gender and Transformation Program at the University of Cape Town as a Mellon May Social Sciences Research Fellow. And Mbalenhle is one of the founders of the Rose Must Fall movement, and ensured that intersectionality was embedded in its initial constitution. So that's a big feat. So yeah, I'd like to first begin with Yvette to offer us her interpretations of the theme and her experiences in feminist activism and consciousness.
Thank you so much, Simamkele, and may I say it's an honor to be invited to this intergenerational conversation. I think you're absolutely right. I think it is needed. I think it is something that we don't do enough of. And obviously this concerns me maybe more at my age, because, you know, I'm at that stage of my life where, you know, my main preoccupation is building capacity and handing over. I've got one, maybe two books left in me, but really, you know, I'm like an old car. I'm nearing the end of my useful life. And so this handing over is becoming more and more of a concern for me. And yes, you know, part of that is intergenerational conversations. And I have some questions of my own, possibly, to the next generation that I will that I'll include towards the end of my presentation. So the guiding questions, my first exposure to feminism and how did that change my life? Well, I was born of a feminist. So you know, there was never a pre-feminist day. And so, you know, I can't really address it. I don't know what my life would have been if I wasn't born a feminist, but I was. So it wasn't like it was an option. How did I become active? Well, I grew up to daughter of this feminist. You know, the stories of me being breastfed at the table while my mother was busy planning an armed struggle against the apartheid regime. And so, you know, that stuff, it comes to you with your mother's milk. Again, there was no, how did I become active? I've occasionally taken a few years sabbatical, sometimes to do a book project, and it's been a thing. I can tell you that, but it's been more the exception than the rule in my life. And I guess that brings me right into that. I guess that's what makes it characteristic. It's a lineage. You know, my mother worked, her mother before her worked, her mother before her worked, and so on, time immemorial. I mean, the only kind of battles we've had is, can we get paid for our work, please? And currently I'm still involved in you know, requesting that my great-grandmother, who was a genocide survivor, for instance, gets paid for her work, which she never did. But there was no never that kind of struggle of, oh, we want the right to work. We would like sometimes the right to not work, like maybe only work 6 days a week, or like maybe only work 14 hours a day, maybe, and sleep occasionally. Those are the kind of you know, demands I'd like to make at my age. But yeah. I guess another deep characteristic, at least for me, both my parents were communists, adherents of Leon Trotsky. And so from the very beginning, my feminist struggle was always intersectional. I was trained very thoroughly in looking at, you know, you've got to change the system within which individual struggles are generated. And so all my actions I've always evaluated as, well, okay, how does it address the short term, the immediate need, but also how is it a fulcrum? How does it leverage to change the system? And needless to say, that's a double working day struggle-wise. I can remember being 14 and my father gave me Angela Davis's autobiography. That was okay because she was a communist. And discovering Black consciousness. And so from the age of 14, again, layering. It's not that I didn't know I was Black or that I wasn't brought up to be Black, but to think very consciously around racism as a mechanism of struggle. So intersectionality, beautiful, but it's a triple working day. What are the lessons learned? And if I could do everything over, I think I would take more time off and give myself more rest. It's possibly a very post-COVID thing, but I'm intensely focused on personal well-being, the well-being of my family, my friends, and just generally spending more time checking in. Now, that being said, I mean, since the early 2000s, I've been that person, you know, when an activist doesn't come to meetings for a while, or when somebody stops returning calls, I'm that person that will call and say, are you okay? What's up? Why haven't we seen you? And so this has to do with having my first major burnout in the late 1999 or so, but becoming more and more aware of issues around activist burnout. And so I'm that person that calls, I'm that person that comes around with some food, make sure you're okay. You will never have noticed this unless you yourself burnt out for a lengthy period. I mean, it's not a part of my work that I talk a lot about. But so I guess my lesson would be around sustainability is such a trite term, but around, you know, I'm a permanent revolutionist like my parents. I was brought up to believe that revolution is something you do every day. There's no obvious endpoint until you've abolished the system. And I think that made the post-94 experience very different for me, because I did not expect Jesus to come in 94. For us in the Black consciousness movement, constitutional negotiations was a step towards other things, you know, primarily the end of white supremacy and obviously changing the economic basis on which we live. And so the post-94 period, I think, was less of a deflation for me. I didn't get that post-independence depression that so many people got. Instead, I was like, okay, what's the step that I'm taking today towards this permanent revolution? Similarly, I wasn't that surprised in 2015. I was overjoyed. I was very happy when the younger generation stood up and said, hey, it's not yet Uhuru. And I was like, really? Newsflash. but delighted to also delighted to see the springs of revolution in the new generation. And it certainly makes me feel great about growing older and handing over. The link, I think, between feminist activism and knowledge production, I talk a lot about the link between theory and practice. And I suppose having lived through the academic, is there a word for, there was a time when the women's movement was an activist movement and it operated in the streets and homes and community halls. And then we had this big fight to get departments of women and gender studies, which was an important battle. I mean, I can remember myself when I did women and gender studies in 1992 and I did my master's in Canada. It was the first time I came across such a qualification. And really, it's only post-94 that we have built and managed to maintain these departments. But what was the cost of making feminism an academic discipline? It was a great achievement, but what is the price that we have paid? And for somebody whose work came from before that period, I do often say, okay, beautiful intellectual work, great papers, wonderful intellectual activism, but how are we connecting it to the work on the ground? And, for one, can the woman on the street who we're writing about, can she even understand what we're saying when we use these words? Yes, sometimes we write for supervisors or to pass exams, but other times we don't. And do we perhaps need different genres of writing? And I'm well aware that, this is nothing new to feminist activists, but just sort of raising that. And the other thing I think we often overlook is how often theory arises out of practice. If you look at the things that you take for granted today, what you call buzz groups, these things of sitting in small groups of 8 and discussing issues, and from those discussions eventually emanating, that started with the feminist movement in the 1960s. Before that, in the Black consciousness movement and the Native peoples movement and so on, this whole notion of consciousness raising groups in small groups. So that's just one example. I think we forget that theory will often arise out of practice. So yes, theory will guide practice, but practice will also guide theory. And how often do we focus on the links? And I could go on about this endlessly, but you get the point. So I think my point on intersectionality, I think I've made already. Look, intersectionality only became a concept in 1986, but we were doing it long before. I'm happy now that it has a name. And I suppose in my generation, in my experience, this emphasis on the material reality, and that also has to be altered. We can't just we can't just expect women to change. We have to recognize the very real reasons why women are stuck in heteropatriarchy. And those very real reasons have to be dealt with. We don't just get to sit around and judge people and go, oh, you're not revolutionary enough. What are the circumstances of your life? So that hasn't changed much for me, except I guess that I have more leisure to do that. So the type of feminist activism we need for current political conditions. I think this whole emphasis on health, I'm hoping will continue. There were systemic reasons how we got COVID in the first place. Systemic reasons relating to, our very high rate of reproduction, overpopulation, encroaching on the wilderness, encroaching on other species' space. The fact that every day at least 3 species are going extinct while humans are constituting more and more and more of the biomass on the planet, I think matters. I think we as feminists have to begin to asking, how are we linking reproductive rights, the choice to not bear children, to bear fewer children, to bear children that consume less. Surely these are deeply, deeply, deeply feminist questions, but how often do we link the work that we do to broader environmental issues? How often do we link the prevalence of heteropatriarchy, putting women in situations where they are forced to bear sons in order to attain some kind of material well-being? How that is linked to the environmental destruction, and asking ourselves very, very urgently, what kind of planet are we leaving for our children? Because people, if we go the way we're going, it's going to be a planet occupied only by human beings. There will be no other species. And really, is that what we want to have? Now, I'm not pointing fingers in the sense that, my generation is the carbon emitting generation. Although we did not know, and I'm aware I sound like a man when I say, although we did not know about the carbon emissions, we have emitted them. We've experienced a level of material well-being that no generation after us will ever know. And so, when I say we need to draw feminism and environmentalism closer, I'm not in any way trying to wash my hands. I take full responsibility for that. And for the kind of consumption that I pursued in my lifetime. Is there a future for the feminist project? Well, people, only if the human species doesn't go extinct. And really, if you've been following the latest, well, you just have to look at what happens in KZN to understand, the word extinction is a big word. It happens one person at a time, one flooded shack at a time. If there's going to be a future for feminism, you are the generation that's going to have to make that happen. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Prof. Rose?
Thank you, Yvette, and thank you, Simamkele. So I think my entrance into feminism comes from the what Betty Friedan has called long time ago, she's American, in the 60s, the problem with no name. I was born into a very conservative Afrikaner family, and so I had to deal with patriarchy and misogyny right from the start, and I had no vocabulary to actually explain that experience and explain what it is that's really bothering me, because there was just no way of talking about that. And I mean, later on when I went to university, it was, for example, experiences with sexual harassment. Also, there was no concept like sexual harassment at the time. But I want to come back to my feminism and well, to activism really, and what started my political activism was my first job was at the University of what is now called University of Limpopo, but it was then called University of the North. And I got there right before the state of emergency, so 1984-85. And I was just a little bit older than my students, a year or two older than my students. And I formed a very strong bond with those students. And at the time, my growing up in homogeneous Afrikaans communities did not prepare me for what the state was doing to Black bodies. And that was the first time I saw that. So the Defence Force had a camp on that campus, and they would send in the students during the night. They were very influenced by Black consciousness, would write slogans in paint on the walls. And then during the day, the administration would come and paint over those slogans, but they would send the soldiers in to pull the students out, and they would whip them outside till they bled, and then they send them back in. And if we got involved, we were also so beaten. So for me, that was the first time I saw the brutality of the apartheid state, and it turned me into an activist. And after that, I left to study in the United States. And it was here that I did a double major in political science and gender studies. And gender studies gave me the vocabulary to understand and to speak about gender inequality. Now, at that time, intersectionality was not something I understood very well. And I think this is the importance of a conference that came to the University of Illinois during the state of emergency time, because I went to Illinois in 1986, so it was still state of emergency time. Two women came to the conference, two South African women, one an African woman and one a white woman. The white women came without the permission of the UDF, and the black women came with the permission. And it was a 3-day conference, and for 2 days there was a very intense and at times very acrimonious debate about the issue of representation, who can speak for whom. And it was the first time that I had to confront my own white privilege as a white South African who was studying in the United States, and I was confronted with this issue about who could speak for whom. And at that same time, Chandra Mohanty was at the University of Illinois, and she wrote on the Western Eyes. And so that was the time then also of the criticism of second wave feminism. And I was very influenced by second wave feminism because it was the time of second wave feminism, and all my lecturers were radical feminists. So for me, I did not understand the essentialization at that point. But then when I started grappling with Mohanty's work, I understood intersectionality. And Yvette is right, that was the lived reality of the women's movement in South Africa was intersectional long before the concept was coined. And I've recently written an article. I've done an audit of the journal Agenda, our South African feminist journal, to look at how, from its start in the 1980s till now, it has written, or how feminists have written about issues of African feminism, African feminist sexuality, intersectionality, and so on. And what that experience did, and that research that was to show that actually we wrote and talked about intersectionality even when we didn't call it that. So I think that is very important. But our generation was a generation that many of us studied abroad, either in Europe or North America, and we came back and we were influenced by the places where we studied. But we were also, we became very aware of the personal is political. And I came back with my PhD right around the time of transition. So we were involved, but we approached, I would say, our feminism from a non-racialism perspective. So that during transition in the National Women's Coalition, and I was on the steering committee for the Western Cape with Gertrude Fester, who was the chair, and that was a wonderful experience. We worked across race, across party lines, across class lines, to actually make an input as feminists into that whole transition process and into the Constitution. And that's how the Women's Charter was formulated, by engaging with grassroots and getting more than 1 million women to tell us what they want in that charter. So for me, that experience was a formative experience. And I was one of the feminist scholars and feminist activists actually designed the gender machinery for South Africa. And that gender machinery made it very clear that we wanted a package of structures. We want structures in the legislative, in the executive, in the Speaker's office. We got the statutory body in the Constitution, the Commission for Gender Equality. So we were very wary of a ministry for women, because our experience and our research showed that once you have a ministry, everything gender gets parked or ghettoized in that ministry, and you get very little out of it. And this is our experience now. So once we started to engage institutional politics, our own politics had to change. And it really also disrupted the Women's National Coalition. And in that disintegration, there came a vacuum on the national level. Now, that doesn't mean that mobilization doesn't happen. It happens on grassroots level, it happens community organizations and so on. But it's far more invisible on a national level. And I think this is the issue for me as a scholar who work on movement building and activism, is what I've called, the engagement around pieces of legislation, so localized temporal movements, but they disappear once we have sorted out the legislation, and we killed the traditional courts bill in that way, right? A very deeply sexist and gender unequal piece of legislation that would have been. So the personal is political, but I think what the younger generation showed us is that, engaging the state is not the way to go, and they have to speak for themselves. But 2015-16 was very clear that the state cannot help us in terms of gender equality. But for us in that generation, the women's movement was the teaching arm, or women's studies became the teaching arm of the women's movement. And so we did, create centers for gender and women's studies. The African Gender Institute at UCT was created. We created sexual harassment policies at our universities. I, for example, wrote the policy for Stellenbosch University with my colleague, feminist activist, Andrinetta Kritzinger. So we did that type of work to engage the gender struggle from an epistemological project, right? So it became an epistemological project, and of course, if we see now how it has become really institutionalized, we have different study centers for women gender studies at different universities, but also some of those gains are being rolled back through the limitation of resources, new liberal management. I mean, I can just talk of my own experience of how the sexual harassment policy has become erased in order for a new liberal way of dealing with this, which I think has not got the emotional security and emotional well-being of students at its heart. So there are gains, but there are also a lot of rollback of those gains. Okay, so I think, what are the lessons that we've learned is that we trusted the state. We trusted the liberation movement and we trusted the state. And we have now seen that the state is not to be trusted. And I think there's a whole body of academic literature that shows this. And this is my forthcoming book on feminist institutionalism is about that. We also need to address patriarchy, I think, in a much more systematic way, patriarchy and misogyny, as well as capitalism. I think Yvette spoke about, the communism, socialism as a redistributive project, and that has disappeared. So we need to go back, because I think capitalism and neoliberal capitalism specifically is part of our problem. We need more intergenerational cooperation. So this is what we're doing today and with this series. And we need to engage more in transnational mobilization. I've looked at some of the transnational movement building, and very often South Africans are not involved in some of these projects. And I think, the younger generation, because they are on social media and because they are connected in the virtual world, are probably more involved than an older generation. And then we should foreground intersectionality. I think the 2016-15 Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, #InTrape culture has showed us that, African intersectional radical feminism, and that was their slogan. Drawing on the four mothers, but also saying we need to renew and reinvigorate these concepts because they have become really very diluted over the last decade or so. So I think for me, the future of feminism is intersectional, non-binary, and we, non-binary in terms of including trans and queer, LGBTIQ, all of that. But also, we need to rethink identity politics. I think identity politics was necessary in a certain historical moment, but I also think it has the downside of being exclusionary. And so my latest project is on solidarity and how we think about solidarity in this present moment. What is solidarity? How do we conceptualize solidarity? How do we theorize solidarity? But I think this is where I want to end, and I hope that the younger generation will speak to some of these issues, and that we at least leave them a legacy that they can draw on. In a world that I think is, Yvette, to come back to your words, what do we leave our children? But I worry deeply. I have 2 daughters in their 20s. What are we leaving them? They are feminists, but they are also, I think, looking at the world that's very bleak in terms of gender-based violence, of terms of look at the Ukraine, the war in the Ukraine, in terms of the planet. It's on a planetary scale, right? And I think, Yvette, your work speaks to that. How are we destroying this planet? What are we doing to stop the destruction? So for me, I think this is the issues that are really looming very large at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, of course. Mbali, are you good to talk?
I am. So before I contribute, I first want to apologize for the bio that Simamkele read out. That was me 5 years ago. So you'll have a sense of the work that I'm doing as I reflect on the topic, because I think even in my journey, there's kind of threads of the past, like thinking about the future and then working in that future and creating a new one. So how I got into feminism is a very interesting story. So as a young child, my mom facilitated a focus group in the family. It was a space where all my aunts, my grandmother, sat around in a circle, and they shared experiences of sexual violence, trauma during childbirth, things that they each dealt with when they were going through teenage pregnancy. So some of these themes for me came up when I was really, really young. And I've never actually thought about it as a focus group until I started doing them myself. And I remember, seeing my mother do that and not quite knowing what it's called, and not quite knowing that is, she had created a safe space. She had created a feminist space. And so for me, that was my first safe space. I continued, and in high school, if you'd ask most people who were in high school with me, most of my public speaking topics were around gender, power. I mean, I wasn't quite aware of how huge and how large this issue was. But in that classroom, I was aware that what I was speaking about was important. Then in university, the way that initial awakening became, I would say, more. It became more inflamed and more enlightened as well, I think, by the environment of the university, of having the time to think, having the time to read, and also being exposed to really good teachers. If I can say something about South African universities, it's that we have really good teachers. And that was a lesson that I learned going to the UK, that, you know, they may produce a lot of research, but in terms of the quality of teaching, we have really good teachers and academics who are teachers in South Africa. And so at UCT, where I did my undergrad in international relations, gender studies, and French, in my second year, I needed an elective, and I thought, gender, why not? You know, and then I took a course by Yaliwe Clark, who has also influenced me quite a bit in my understanding of gender, and also in its understanding its place in politics and development. And so I took a course, Gender and the Politics of Development, and I actually ended up teaching on that course much later, where I was teaching part-time and also working in the development sector. So that gave me a very critical eye while I was reading up on policies about SADC and gender and development, looking at kind of AU policies and drafting recommendations for the African Union, but also I had this consciousness, you know, that guided me as I was doing this, and really that course afforded me the skills, and so I like to constantly balance the, you know, being engaged in theory, but then also being engaged in the practice of feminism, and trying to institutionalize, you know, the practice of it. So I see practice existing as like going on the front lines, as we did as the Rhodes Must Fall generation, you know, and facing the police, going to parliament and giving those demands. That is a part of practice. But also practice is, you know, being part of like the Gender Council, or being part of a committee that's looking at a particular policy that's going to affect a large group of people, and ensuring that feminism sits there and makes people's understanding of gender, it complicates it, and it furthers it, because in political institutions and in the development sector, they're very comfortable with using the word gender, but not necessarily the word feminism. So my role in those places is to bring that discomfort. And I brought that discomfort when I was a research consultant for the African Union, and I brought ideas around African feminism, looking at regionalism with the lens of African feminism and what that actually means, because in essence, African feminism is a Pan-African movement. And so how can you speak about, you know, regional politics without speaking about feminism? So my role in some of these institutions that are, I won't say they're ahead of the curve, because they're definitely not. And I also agree with Professor Host to say that, you know, there's a lot of trust that's placed in the state, in institutions to do the work of feminism, and they take up more space than feminists themselves, right? If you look at the effect of the Am I Next movement, the Stop Killing Women movement, those movements actually pushed the presidency to do something about gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. although we can be critical about, what's actually been achieved, but the fact that, the summit happened in 2018, and after the summit, there was a national strategic plan that was set up, and now there's amendments to the bills, the new ones that have come out now in January. So you can see that really there definitely is like feminist activism has really influenced a lot, and I think if I'm reflecting on the type of activism that exists now, the type that either it starts on social media, and then it becomes both an online and an offline movement, or it begins offline and then becomes an online movement, and then grows and becomes a large scale march. So there's a lot of very interesting dynamics where offline and online activism are constantly in conversation, and I think that is also another form of praxis, and like theory exists online. And my master's thesis that I actually based on the activism of Dr. Stella Nyanzi in Uganda looked at some of the work that she's doing online, and I began to theorize that because we can't only look at the classroom as a place for theory. Theory exists outside of the classroom, and then it comes and influences knowledge production. And the thing is, it's it's kind of like an oscillating ball. So like on the one side, there's theory, on the other side, there's activism, and this ball is often just going up and down, up and down. And I think that's how, theory develops and how practice also develops. And so with the legacy of feminism, I think because I really had a lot of time with the African Gender Institute as an undergrad student. I then went on to do my postgrad in gender and transformation. So I'm well aware of the legacy of Black feminism, or Black US feminism, as I also spent some time in the US in Williamstown, where I got to reflect on the relationship between Black feminism in the US and articulations of Black feminism, African feminism, womanism in Africa. So that the legacy of feminism is very important, and I think especially on the continent, because feminism was entwined in Africa's liberation. It's in some cases led African liberation movements, and I think also having that gendered lens has allowed me to find the literature that isn't mainstream. And Simamkele, Sandy Lendelu, and I were part of actually a panel that was looking at the erasure of Black women in the liberation archive, and like how we can begin to write ourselves in history, and also to kind of occupy the position of being a rioter on the streets and an actual writer, because that is not often seen as the same person. So we really try to destabilize how the rioter is seen. So just reflections on the present and the future. I hope I still have time, Simamkele.
I just sent you a message.
Okay. I think we'll get reflections on the present and future in the Q&A.
Okay.
I'll leave it there. Yeah.
So much, Mbali. I don't know if Apiwe is still with us. I know she was having challenges connecting. Apiwe?
Hi, Sima. I'm still here. Can you hear me properly?
Okay, great. Okay. Over to you.
All right. Am I audible enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Oleni. So my name is Wapio Ntlameza, and as Sima has stipulated, we go a long way. And I guess part of this journey as well just makes me reflect in terms of that. So you'll see from the sequence of how I tell the story that some in the midst of it or between it all, you'll see how I highlight the lessons learned in terms of even the movements that I've been part of, but also just the experiences that I've had as well. So thank you so much, though, Sima, for inviting me once again. This is a huge honor to be part of be part of this panel. I was introduced to feminism, I think my family would say at the age of 14. I think they would start to pinpoint a few threads there that they would say, actually now it all makes sense. And that's often because of how I grew up. So I am from Stagspruit. And so part of that, and I think issues that I'm also dealing with now is issues of identity that I'll later on talk about. But I think having had an experience of from an really young age, not knowing how to define violence, but knowing what is right and wrong. And so I think from that age, that's when apparently I'd give even an unsolicited advice to the likes of my mother and obviously my father, who I think part of my journey at that time was that I had viewed him for so many years as this perfect father figure, right? Who was totally different from what I later on found out. And so part of my journey with feminism is personal. And this is a question I was asked a few years ago, and I didn't think it was as personal as it is, because they asked, why are you so much of a feminist? And having to just reflect on that, and especially now, right? 2 years later, grieving and all that. But that has been my experiences. And then just moving, sorry about that, and moving into institutions like and I hope I'm still audible, Simi. Thank you. Institutions like the University of Forte, which I think ignited all of that feminism, because I came into an institution whereby a lot of wrongdoing is normalized. The cases were normalized, the sexism, the misogyny, but also there wasn't time, or time wasn't delegated to actually discuss such operations and systems in place. And I think when I joined the likes of Indlovukazi, Women in Empowerment, which was an organization formed by young women activists from the University of Forte, who also had a political background. And so I think this is part of when we talk about legacy, and that meant a lot for me, because then I got to continue that legacy and lead it somewhere, basically for other people to take over. But within Glovokazi, what we then realized were the cases that were sidelined, and sometimes deliberately so, by management. And so often then I started with a lot of advocacy around gender-based violence, and that meant even people and victims and survivors finding comfort to actually come to Indlovukazi to report their cases. Later on, I think because of trust and safety, we then were some form of a system of approach that the Institute later on recognized in some way. But I think what was a trigger was the dawn of social media, because especially in institutions like the University of Fort Hare, which are historically Black in nature. And so when we talk about even the fees must fall, so part of the issues of finances, those are struggles that I can very much reassure you that the University of Fort Hare and Walter Sisulu University have been fighting for decades before. But I think the languaging wasn't there to intend it, but also just, I think, as we know, socioeconomic factors as well, and privileges when it comes to different institutes play a huge factor. And so that meant, even so, part of our struggles were not highlighted even by media. And I remember there was this one specific case that was a score for us, regardless of how sad it was. And this really happened in one of the institutions, sorry, the residences. And what was unfortunate was that I remember one of my a senior lecturer, a senior lecturer one day caught me with the victim and was asked to inquire as to what I was doing with that person. Is that a victim? So you can imagine already there's conversations that are already spoken about without even anyone wanting to feel comfortable to share about those comfortabilities. But that made me that ensured to me and highlighted how there's a culture in place. And even this same culture was the same person that ensured that this young woman doesn't get justice. But basically, the institution did admit and found them guilty, but gave them community service. So you can imagine. And so that then, with the dawn of social media, we found strategies, and that meant realizing that, oh, now part of our the people that are coming forward, and even with first years, is that, well, it's the same even management, right? And so, and I think part of the lessons that it's quickly to learn the politics as well, because one thing that resonate with such institutions that like the University of Fort Hare, even the administration is run politically, and so issues such as gender-based violence as well are treated as such. And part of the lessons would be even just the threats that would come after that, right? And how would be alienated as activists, and which still happens. And I think even today, and we're starting to have even those conversations even on social media. But I think being frustrated and realizing that more or less we know that we are this group of perhaps 10 activists in an institute of this nature, and already we're getting a lot of names. We called angry Black woman. So those, and that was back then. So those things would no longer surprise me right now. I'm just like, yes, definitely I am angry. And I have a lot to be angry about as a Black woman. But it, that's when we started exposing and using media as well to our favor. And that meant also just using politics. So we had a few people also uh, inside management. That meant as activists and feminists, honestly, from my end as well, I had to be on the lurk and sometimes play the politics to make sure that the genuine flight and oppression of women is highlighted, and that like it's normal, not normalized. It's not like it's okay, more than anything. But I think just when you talk about erasure, Sima, like that was in I remember in 2016, we marched, and the likes of Batabile, Lamine was there, because that was even the centenary year of the University of Fort Hare, and we said that, and this was led after through movements such as the area roads movement that we followed after, that we also want a policy in place. And this is when we found out also the institution had a lot of different policies that are not integrated, but also that there's no pathways as to where victims should go and whatnot. And so part of that exercise was to silence. And so that meant 2 years later, that policy was not instituted, even though a task team was formulated. And even now, when we talk about erasure, we still like the emphasis of, and I think sometimes how the flights can easily be taken away through politics, right? And I know that we had a struggle where some of the SRC members were later on taking ownership of women's struggles and all this work coming into play. So a form of just wanting to raise women at the same time, right? And then I think if we then move on just from institutionalizing to just sexual harassment and rape in institutes. I think, but also what is important, movements like, for instance, your Me Too, right? They highlighted how just for women alone, right? There's still women in work, so that's still a priority, and sexual harassment is a thing. And I think part of my journey, getting into the workforce, was realizing that actually, so you are this well-known feminist, and you think that these people in the same NGO spaces, and mind you, I'm going to track this later and link it to the total shutdown. Because when we say that, and this is what Prof. You talked about, that we relied too much on government. Uh, Honestly, that is a coordination and an alliance that is needed, and unfortunately that we are unable to move away from. However, yes, I think we do as movements, we need to be very much aware of donors and the requirements that comes with, especially even from a civil society organization perspective, right? Where what is required and what is the benefit for survivors often becomes a clash. But also in terms of tokenism, if we can highlight even, excuse me, from just to the fees must fall, and how later on that plight was taken over through political intentions to infiltrate into that movement, right? But tokenism is very important in our spaces, and it's so often done with. And I link it because after that, I was a spokesperson for Total Shutdown in the Eastern Cape, and for me, and I think part of the lessons is that we talked about it being intersectional, but you could feel and the tensions within even the movement, that there's inclusivity is an issue, right? But even from that plight alone, some amongst us, when we started, having these discussions with government, it became more of a scheme, right, to promote themselves to higher ranking positions, and that delineated the entire struggle of a total shutdown, and it became more of positions, and as a result, the people leading in districts and regions were left then not having more of insight or as to what is going on. And I think the total shutdown is a very important case because we've had them, right? But how that was more linked to our community rooted, it was more community rooted, and it diversified into national politics, the best that we could have done. But I think those issues that I then again finance, tokenism, the transpired positions, the blurred lines that coming into this place, and I think part of what we need to learn, and I've constantly had this issue where within the space, and I've always said, and back in even 2015, where I don't have a problem with women that are politically affiliated. In nature, we are, because our politics are personal, right? But you'd find that, especially with institutions like your University of Pretoria, where language is very important, and how politicians use language either to perpetuate further or instill a certain culture right? And so you'd find languages, even with some of us, where we're not able to hold our own political counterparts accountable for rape cases, but then find an excuse and therefore just victim blame, right? And that would be an issue. And I remember I used to, and this is one, and I think it would be a very controversial one, because I remember that's when the issues that I would have, because in these movements, and so many that Sima, I won't detail, but there's been a deliberate plan even where there's sabotage even from the ANC Women's League that we've seen all these years, and for me, even especially where I was intentional, even at the University of Pretoria, that you would not in any movement that is for women bring and queer people bring, like, where even regalia associated with your political party, but that happens, and so it leads to the radicalness where sometimes you just have to call out. But I think after all those events and the cases rising up, there hasn't been much of time to reflect. And I remember I'm the one of them that wrote even a Facebook post just immediately after total shutdown to say I do hope that we introspect and actually have time to talk, because I was just saddened how even just those spaces were infiltrated by Women's League, and especially in the Eastern Cape, just someone who was more of a spokesperson. The day before, I caught her mobilizing for ANC Women's League, which was supposed to surprise us the following day using our own route, and it did. And so those are the things of infiltration that I'm talking about, and part of even the ANC Women's League being used for political as well, political reasons, but also and forsaking as well the purpose. And I just wanted to highlight that. But I think part of the movements as well with the hashtag movements that we've had is that they've ignited a lot of feminist talk that is needed, but also have connected a lot of us. And I think they've made it easier for a lot of survivors and victims to find more community through social media. But most importantly, in terms of documenting our stories. Thank you, Siman. Almost done. Documenting our stories, that has been purposely dealt well through social media, and I think that's still needed to take us forward when it comes to feminist imagination. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Siman.
Thank you so much, Aviwe. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm looking at the time now. It's 1:42. So if you look at the chat, I've asked if anyone has comments or questions, including the panel. If there's a point of discussion that you'd like to raise with each other, please let me know, because we just have under 20 minutes left of the dialogue. Okay, there's one question on the chat. They acknowledge that they missed the first part of the meeting, so they're not sure if it was already discussed. But the specific question is there a specific role for feminists or womanists in fighting climate change? If so, why feminists per se? What is the connection, or what is this role exactly? Srila says, I'd be interested in the speaker's reflection on xenophobia and what African feminist paradigms can forward in terms of our understanding and organizing around this urgent issue. So climate change and xenophobia. I'm trying to see if there are any hands raised for people that want to ask a question. Okay. Can I ask a question? It's going to be long-winded. So Yvette, made an important I think reflection about if the role or emphasis that they had in making sure that gender studies was included in or incorporated in university departments, such as gender studies, etc., etc. And if that then moved, the purpose of feminist theory away from the streets and into the classroom. But the beauty for me in Bali's reflection and her stating that she came, her feminist consciousness heightened through studying gender studies at the African Gender Institute with lecturers such as Yaliwe, etc. And so it means that, and we know what Rhodes Must Fall then accomplished. So it means that I think for me, the battle was not futile to try and incorporate, gender studies as a field of study in universities. However, then my question is, we know that, for any kind of tangible support or acknowledgement that we have received from the state in the last, in the democratic era, that it's been through the streets, it's been through direct action. And even the total shutdown movement, for us to have this NSP, it's because women and gender non-conforming people shut down the country. So in this, COVID pandemic times has changed and altered the way in which we mobilize. We can't go into the street as effectively to mobilize. So then what else can we do? How can we change our mobilizing strategies to be reflective of our times, but also to be rooted in direct action? So those are the three questions. Speakers? Oh, I see another one. The last one, thank you for the discussion today. I'd like to ask, what are further ways to consolidate transnational, intergeneration, and multidisciplinary feminist conversations within Africa and the global South? So Yvette, Amanda, Apiwe, Mbalenhle, over to you.
Shall I start, Simamkele?
Yes, please, Yvette.
Thank you. As to the first question on climate change, like I say, there's a congruence between the feminist emphasis on reproductive rights and environmental disasters, and that's based on the assumption that if a woman had free choice, she wouldn't choose to have more children than she could feed. I mean, it may be a very matriarchal assumption, but I think a reasonable one. I once did a very abstruse calculation that said that, well, if one third of all women are raped at least once in their lifetime, doesn't that mean that 30% of the children that are born weren't planned and not necessarily provided for? So, and I know this is a huge revolution in images of conventional images of Black femininity. I myself have chosen to not have children. But very few people make that choice, and it's not only about that, it's about having fewer children that consume less. I do think it's a critical issue for the global South. In 2020, because of lockdown, for the first time since the 1750s, we actually reduced our global emissions by over 6%. That showed us that it could be done. All these things that we said we couldn't do, we did in 2020. The problem came in 2021 when we started undoing some of them, and our climate emissions shot up to the highest in human history. Well, since we started measurements. But the interesting thing about the increase in 2021 is most of it, over 60%, was due to an increase in carbon emissions in India and China. So the global North, who has a historical obligation, is actually beginning to shoulder that burden and starting to reduce their carbon emissions. But the global South, simply because there's so many of us, I mean, you take 1 billion Chinese and 3/4 billion Indians, they have huge middle classes. And as those middle classes have begun to consume more, we're seeing this record rise in global carbon emissions. So what I'm trying to say, there needs to be other ways to model Black prosperity. There needs to be other ways to live better lives that involves not destroying the earth. And to me, that's at its core feminist value. But that's also how you can see the link that I make between climate change, global shutdown, and other very feminist movements. You know, I'm convinced that if men had to change babies' nappies, we would have far fewer children. And so we have to think around the way that we're allowing men off the hook with fatherhood through patriarchy, you know, and how that affects population increase. Anyway, I could go on about this forever. Look, I believe that wherever you are placed is a terrain of struggle. Certainly having done both, you know, as a commissioner of gender equality, I was maybe not necessarily inside the system, but tasked with monitoring the system. And so I can tell you authoritatively that it's better to have a good person in the system than to have a bad person in the system. The system is the system. Yes, it needs to be changed, but we also have individual responsibility for our actions. So I don't necessarily think it was wrong in '94 to push all our feminists into the state. We needed them there to protect our interests. What I do remember, I was once marketing soap at a renewable energy festival, and the stall next to me was Nozise Madlala Rutledge. And she said to me, well, Yvette, you know, I went into Parliament 15 years ago thinking I was going to change the system, and came out 15 years later realizing the system has changed me. So where she was selling soy wax candles to get sex workers off the street, and I was selling soap to improve our environment. But we both curiously reached the same conclusion at the same time, which is there's work to be done in the system. But at some point, you burn out, you need to get out, and then you look at what are the other terrains of struggle outside the system. I think what I would like to see a lot more of is people looking at the interconnections. I think why we struggled after '94 was precisely we'd sent our best and brightest into the state. Who did that leave? Who did we train to take over after us? And so you can see the Zuma backlash and the Zuma genocide of queers as an example of what happens when you leave your civil society movement weak. When you take your best and your brightest and you remove them from the movement and you go stick them somewhere else. So as you can see, this is why my latter years are concerned with issues around training, capacity building, handing over. I think my advice would be you need to build organizational infrastructures. See the big movements, fees must fall, total shutdown and so on, as flashes in the pan. Through each of these large movements, you're consistently recruiting people to your cause, and that fundamentally rests on the strength of your organizational infrastructure. If your organizational infrastructure is weak, as you can see, you can lose gains as quickly as you find. So I think paying more attention to the day-to-day, weekly slog on the ground is what builds powerful movements inside the system. That would be my approach.
Can I just quickly say hi to Shireen? Welcome, Shireen. It must be some very early hour there at your place, huh?
Sorry, I can't. Sorry, I don't know how to use Teams like this, so I'm battling a bit. It's not that early. It's just that I am not a morning person, as you know, Amanda.
All right. Well, welcome. Let me take a stab at Sheila's question about xenophobia. So I think, you know, that's another intersectionality, right? An intersectionality with nationality and national origin. And I think, you know, it's part of that continuum of violence against people. So for me, I think we're far too eager to look at, you know, carcerality and how to deal with this type of violence through, you know, incarceration of people and the carceral state. I think feminists in the global south need to do much more thinking about the carceral state than we are actually doing. And it's not to say, you know, that South Africa has very, I think that the policies that exist they're not implemented. But then you go and you look at Landela Deportation Center and you look at the carcerality of, I had a student doing this. She was just incredibly lucky and persistent to get into Landela. But it's absolutely awful what happens there, and people get stuck in limbo for years, and there's a lot of gender-based violence going on in Landela. So you know, I think there's a lot of work for feminists to be done there, but it's very difficult. And I also think we have to think much more about vigilante justice, because this is what we have now. Operation Dudula, I think, is a really, really dangerous movement, and it's not, you know, it's not going to end well. But what is invisible is what happens to women in those conditions. You know, I think we are homogenize migrants, and we don't look at the gendered effects, how it affects men and women differently. Yeah, so, you know, that's what I would say about that. But I think the younger feminists also need to get a chance.
There are questions directed at Bali and Apiwe from Prof. Bola. Did you see that?
Yes, I did. Yeah, so I'm going to try and quickly address that question. I think the xenophobia question, I have a different angle to it. For me, you know, xenophobia is, it does add another intersection, which is nationalism, but it's also so intertwined with race, and it's intertwined with gender. And the way in which xenophobia is recorded, it's mostly men fighting against men, and you don't hear the story of migrant women. And I think it's really important that we understand some of the struggles that migrant women go through when they come to South Africa. And part of the work that I've been doing is looking at the provision of sexual and reproductive health rights, and specifically looking at migrant women who come to South Africa to give birth, and the type of xenophobia that they experience in our hospitals really is a threat to their life and the lives of their children. But we don't hear that narrative often enough. And also the reason why xenophobia is so interlinked with race is because it is Afrophobia that is how it manifests. Yeah, it manifests as Afrophobia because people, foreign nationals from the West or the parts of Asia, I would say Southeast Asia, there is an element of xenophobia there with Pakistanis, but really, most of it is targeted towards African nationals. So really, we need to be very nuanced with how we understand xenophobia, because there's really a lot there. Just to address Prof. Gola's question, hi also. I think, you know, Prof. Gola is another one of our ancestors that has really influenced me as well, both her work and her speaking work, but it's all connected because it's one person. So basically, I think that what I want to emphasize, and I think the generation before us doesn't quite see it as knowledge, but I'm gonna table it as knowledge. So the internet never forgets, and I think that's really important when we're thinking about documenting our lives as feminists. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the form of a journal article. You know, ensuring that our lives and our activism are recorded in that way. There are numerous ways in which we can record history in the making. So I would say there are digital archives being formed every day with the type of activism taking place online, but also this generation doesn't value as much how important, you know, being involved in writing projects and like book projects, journal articles, and making, you know, the history work that we do elsewhere also part of that space. So I'm just going to leave it there.
Apiwe?
Yes. Thank you, Asima, for the opportunity. I'm just going to touch on just the xenophobic protest, right? Which also, just if we can take it back even to some of the Fees Must Fall movements as well, and if we have to underline the violent nature of our protests, and I think that's the toxic masculinity that we need to deal with. And I think part of the conversations that are not happening is tracing it back and the violence and having those discussions. And I think where even organizations and these movements by men should be doing, and those are very important. But what from my end of view, what I've been doing personally, and and this comes after I soon realized that we can do so much of marching, right? And because we've done that so many countless times, but it means that there's certain things that we can also do, and even innovative ways of mobilizing. And so for me, I was challenged by wanting to also find linkages between research, but also whether my experience being in a field that is focused on either sexual harassment, violence, even in higher institutions. So I have been working even with, for instance, the Department of Higher Education in terms of doing more even policy work in terms of that, but also just finding more guidelines, I think, for institutions at a more national level, and a consolidated plan even. But I think what's also important is how we find linkages even in spaces such as whether work, just how the vulnerabilities that are there, so that we find solutions as well. And so I've been basically focused on that and trying to find diverse conversations. But part of the work is doing more of the research and the archival work that is needed, and documenting, which is essential. And I think that we are lacking there, but that's definitely how you can make sure that erasure is minimized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. There are more questions from the chat. Here, speakers, are you seeing them? There's one from, who wants to tackle which one first? Bali, you muted?
Yes, so can I tackle the workplace bullying question? And that's also because it's very close to home with the work that I'm doing right now at the University of Pretoria. So I just I want to say that workplace bullying exists because of the unaddressed patriarchy that is present in society. And then from society, it becomes embedded in our institutions. And workplaces are no different from higher education and like institutions of higher education or corporate. We are dealing with the same kind of patriarchy. And I think that, you know, in these institutions, people have thought of, I mean, there was a generation that looked at gender mainstreaming, right, as the way to integrate change and gender equality in institutions, but really that had its limitations, right? And there's been lots of articles critiquing gender mainstreaming, and I think, you know, we need to really look at what sustainable change, institutional change looks like. And so the work that I do with the University of Pretoria is kind of conscientizing people, giving them models and the tools to go out and implement interventions in their respective organizations so that gender is integrated in you know, in everyday life. And that really addresses patriarchy and social norms that are disruptive, harmful, and also then translates into bullying.
Thanks, Buddy. Yvette and Amanda, there are questions for you from Prof. Gola in the chat. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Pumla, and I'm so glad you're attending. You know, I think that, like I said, the state is not the place to put our hopes, and maybe it's never been. So that I think civil society, and I specifically think a younger radical generation of feminists are already doing this, right? You know, we've had the hashtag movements, we've had their writing, we have their poetry. So online becomes very important for this type of energy. What I'm more concerned about is the fact that we don't seem to be able to get a movement off the ground to fight against gender-based violence. And you know, hashtag total shutdown, but that was a moment. It was a moment in time. So how do we sustain this type of activism? So I think there's a strange contradiction, right? So we have this energy on online spaces, and then we have the online going into the real world, but it's difficult to sustain that. And I think this is what we need to think about, is how do we sustain the energy that's in the online spaces once we take that activism to the streets. But my really, I think that you know, young feminists are doing amazing work, and that they, yeah, you are our hope for the future. Yvette, we can't hear you.
I was saying thank you for those questions, Professor. Kola always pushes me to stretch my mind. I guess new spaces for feminist activism. Well, you know, bottom line is it's not up to me. I'm on my way out, so I wouldn't be I'm not the one to make those choices, but I can tell you what I see. And I think there are a lot more spaces for feminist activism than we are really foregrounding. And I guess my parallel is when I joined the CG in 2007, and everybody was talking about, oh, the demise of the women's movement, the demise of the women's movement. And I suffered sort of a cognitive dissonance, because at that very time, as I was interacting with you know, the Rural Women's Assembly, the women in the environmental movement, Gender CC, I saw all these hundreds of new women's organizations springing up everywhere. So there was sort of this despair in the literature, but this actual vibrancy on the ground. And that's when I said to myself, well, feminism isn't always where you look. Sometimes academics are looking in the wrong places, you know. So that would be my caution. It's not my question to answer, but that when you answer it, may make sure that your point of view is as wide as you possibly can. I'm not going to go so far as to say Twitter is necessarily a space of activism. I'm a little bit more old-fashioned than that, but I love the stuff that sprung up during COVID. I mean, during lockdown, there were these mutual aid networks. You know, let's all get together and feed somebody, feed a preschool or something. And from that came the community garden movement, which I love because it ticks all those things, right? Gives you something else to do besides making babies. It provides food for the community, restores the environment, but also provides a network space for feminist activism that we've lost. If you remember, back in the village, there's a part of the river where all the women do their washing. It's a social space. It's a space of networking. It's where the village's problems get resolved. We lost that when we become urbanized. And it's common sense when you do the installation of water taps in cities, you're supposed to consider things like, what are the social dynamics around it? What networks are you creating? But there are new water taps in all sorts of interesting spaces. And I really don't care what you call it. Are you getting together to knit jerseys or crochet or grow food or plant trees or whatever you're doing? Out of that comes feminism. So like I said, I think the search for new spaces, at least at my age, is more search for new glasses. How am I seeing what's going on around? And how do I interpret that? How do I interpret that into activism in various ways?
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time. We're 10 minutes late. So thank you for everyone who stayed on. I'd like for the panel to just offer us closing remarks, also while paying attention to some of the questions. Oh, I'm so sorry. Sandra had her hand up. So before I close, is she still around? Are they still around, Sandra?
Yes, I'm still around.
Yes.
The question was supposed to be to Apiwe. It was related to, I think I liked what she talked about when she talked about, personal positioning when people get into such spaces and such movements where we all think that we are there for a common purpose, but then in the end, it translates into something else. So I was just interested in finding out from her how she has seen it, manifesting in the organizations that she's been working with, and how they've been able to overcome such. Because the reason why I'm interested in such a question is that I'm a doctoral student. I'm doing a study on intersectional women's experiences in the STEM environment. And you can imagine we're talking about an environment that is highly male-dominated. And then one of the biggest challenges is that people are so vocal while they are hoping for something themselves. And then as soon as they get it, then it doesn't matter anymore. So that's where my interest is coming from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that question. So from the personal experiences, as like the movements that I've highlighted, where you it will be personal gain and also people getting positions. But I think as well, even in terms of NGO spaces, a lot of that happens whereby even you'd find that some NGOs would be shielding perpetrators, right? And that's why I said even funding then comes into place. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much discussion that has happened, I think, from the lenses of feminism in terms of calling out, because we do know. I know that we often here and there when an incident happens, even on our social media platforms, right? But we do shame away from actually, and this is part of the dilemma that I said earlier about reflection, which is very much needed to also paving the way for the future, right? And I think what's more important for me, as I've learned that for effective change, there is an element of need for radicalness, right? And part of that also means standing up even for victims or survivors or even yourself means that you have to call out. You have to just opinionate yourself in terms of wrongdoing, and that stems from there. And so even with when I talk about my sexual harassment case, it needed me being a fighter for myself now rather than the usual way around. But making sure that, because now it's showing me a different sphere where we know now in terms of the workspaces, all right, capitalism, misogyny is more imprinted, and it's very devastating, especially when policies are not there, even the advocacy is not there. But it starts somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe we can just do a round of final closing remarks from each of the speakers.
Well, thank you. I suppose my final note is one of overwhelming optimism. These are good historical times. If you remember the 19th century, what the Spanish flu achieved was literally a fall in the rate of reproduction for about 10 years. And literally at that movement, when the population was falling rather than increasing, it pushed Western capitalism into a state of crisis. You had the Wall Street crash of 1929. You had the First and the Second World War. And after the Second World War, at the point when the metropole powers were at its weakest, was our beautiful dawn of African independence. So the time has never been so good for decolonization in the last 80 years. And hopefully the young generation will seize upon this historical opportunity and take things further. The difference is, of course, you know, when Zambia became independent in 1962, I always remember this because I was a child migrant in Zambia. They only had 2 university graduates for the entire country. And what we've achieved in the last 70, 80 years is we have educated people. We have, again, the same unparalleled historical opportunity, but this time we are coming at it with young, committed, and educated, highly skilled cadres. So I'm very excited about the future. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank everybody who attended for coming and for being part of this series. I think, you know, it is what we've heard today is really interesting and speaks to a bigger transformation also in terms of how we think about gender in the institutions. And there is a question here about in the chat, if there's been a change since fees must fall in higher education. And I want to say, I think there's been a consciousness, but what COVID has done for us is to actually put us 2 years back, because universities became so overwhelmed by the pandemic and how to teach online and all other issues that the gender transformation of universities is now, again, you know, it's put us back and it's lagging behind. So we will have to recreate that energy. And so, you know, I think that is, again, up to the students to bring that energy back in and to say, well, we need to take up where we left off. But I also think, you know, there is a consciousness now, and there is a greater consciousness about gender-based violence in our institutions, and we should just actually not let it slide, but you know, take on that burden again. And unfortunately, it is a burden that falls on the shoulders of those of us who have a consciousness about these issues. But I hope to see all of you at the next seminar.
Okay, I'm gonna go next. I'm just gonna leave you with my feminist futures, since I really didn't, you know, get to that. So my last remark is to say that, you know, my ideal feminist future is a South Africa that actually doesn't need feminism. Because, you know, the essence of feminism is that, you know, it's trying to undo, you know, the detrimental effects of patriarchy, and to undo you know, the power relations that come with it. So for me, my feminist future is actually feminism doesn't exist anymore. Well, there's no need for it. We can read it as like scholarly work, but not necessarily like need to live the politics of it, you know. But, you know, that's idealistic. And I you know, I hope for that world. But I'm going to leave everyone with a bit of a challenge. I know we've spoken a lot about xenophobia, Afrophobia, and building transnational connections. I think something that has really grown me and my feminism a lot, especially after the Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall movement, was actually just stepping outside of the borders of South Africa and asking myself, what is happening elsewhere? And like, where can my voice be useful to extend the struggles of others to places they wouldn't ordinarily get to? So you know, being that extension. So my challenge is, yeah, for all of you, be that extension. And for me, that space right now is called Feministing While African. It's a WhatsApp group, but it's a very engaged WhatsApp group. There's discussions about everything and anything African and feminism. So yeah, my challenge is that you should just extend yourselves.
Thank you. I think I'll just leave everyone with with the thought that activism is an everyday act, as one of the speakers has highlighted. And so even though we're reflecting on how we've mobilized before pre-COVID, but I think one thing that we should also just take into cognizance, the platforms that we already have that are part of our communication and that have at least brought us together. But I want us to also note that in the midst as well, cyberbullying, revenge porn, homophobia, sexism has also escalated. And hence then I leave you with the message of activism is a daily act. And even in those digital spaces where much more harm is especially done, especially in such an area. But also part of the work that we do with the research documenting is very important, because we need to note that with COVID-19, it has reversed some of the gains from feminism. And so there's a lot that we need to do. There's a lot that we need to document. But yeah, activism every day. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our speakers who honored our invitation today. And thank you to everyone who stayed behind. Yes, the recording will be made available. Prof. Host started a YouTube channel, and the recordings from the seminar series will be there. But before I let you go, I just want to tell you about the other seminars that we have in store. So the next one is titled Feminist Artists and Decolonializing Modes of Feminist Knowledge Production, which is taking place on the 18th of May. The third one is Feminist Legal Gains and Setbacks, from the Zuma rape trial to the Toko judgment, taking place on the 15th of June. And the last one is More Than a T-shirt, Slogan, or Commodity, remembering the radical roots of feminism. We will deal with all things class. So please do join us for our exciting panels coming up. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.